Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Thanks for joining the first edition of our series, Illinois Authors. And we couldn't be more pleased to kick it off with one of the iconic reporters, writers, journalists, historians in Illinois, Bob Hartley. Mr. Hartley has been around Illinois politics for a long time. He was a reporter for 4 decades, reporter and editor. He's been a writer, writes prolifically, more than a half dozen books on history and politics, and is just a font of information. And we could spend all day talking about his books. We're going to focus on 2 of them, and they're 2 of my favorites. One of them is called Powell of Illinois, A Lifelong Democrat, which Bob published in 1999. And the second one is Paul Simon, The Political Journey of an Illinois Original, which he published in 2009. So these are 2 books we're going to talk about. I also say in preparing for this, I went through a lengthy and very, very interesting oral history that he gave for the Lincoln Library in Springfield. It was about 180 pages long, chalked with a lot of really interesting information about Bob's career and his writing. So Bob, we're delighted to have with you. You're joining us from Colorado. Thank you so much.
I'm delighted to be here and to help you launch what I think is a really important contribution to Illinois history and the authors who do it.
Well, great. Thank you. As I said, we did not think we could start at a better place than with you. Now, Bob, you're from Kansas, Winfield, Kansas, but you've spent a good chunk of your career as a reporter and editor in Illinois. And I saw you quoted one place saying you loved every minute of it. Tell us about sort of the thrill and the delight of being a reporter and covering Illinois politics in the early phases of your career.
Well, I went to work for a newspaper in East St. Louis, which someone might think was not much to be thankful for. They were doing some of the more significant investigative reporting at that time, many years ago, and the editor there was, I believe, one of the finest editors I ever worked for or with. And so there was and immediately by joining it was in the Metro East Journal, by joining that newspaper, I had an introduction to what was a different kind of life. I remember my first few days, I was a copy editor there for the paper, and I picked up a story that one of the reporters had done, and it was a story about someone who had been shot at his front door in East St. Louis the night before, shot and killed. It was about 3 paragraphs long. And I said to the city editor, I said, well, this story's got to be developed. This is a heck of a deal. We ought to have more on this. He looked at me and he said, Bob, you're new here, and this is East St. Louis. So that was my introduction. But I fell in love with Illinois politics and Illinois history, as a matter of fact. And it was developed there largely. But when I went to work in Decatur, I made the acquaintance of Bob Howard, who was at that time a retired Chicago Tribune reporter of some note. And he was the head of the Historical Society, Illinois Historical Society. And Bob Howard really inspired me more than anybody at the beginning to devote some time and effort to writing books. He said, the best books are written by journalists. And of course, he was one. And but he said, more journalists need to write books because they can make them come alive. And I remembered that ever since. Bob was a great mentor for me. So that was how I really got inspired by it. And once you get the bug, you can't get rid of it, no matter where you live. When we left Illinois and moved to Ohio and then to Washington State, I still kept in touch with what was going on in Illinois, and because I couldn't get rid of it. I couldn't get it out of my soul.
Well, Bob, I saw just on playing on that theme in this interview you did, you're talking about, having lived elsewhere and having worked in other communities, Idaho, Washington State, Ohio, et cetera. But you said, I'm hung up on Illinois history, and I admit it, I love it. So what's keeping me back? And the stories are so good. There are an unlimited number of good stories here, and I feel comfortable doing it. Do you think Illinois politics is unusually interesting?
Well, I think every state has interesting political stories. I suppose I'd like to think that Illinois has more, but that's only because I'm working in it on the Illinois side. But in other states where I've lived, as I've learned more about the politics there, Washington State, for example, some terrific political stories there. I just think that Illinois happened to be where I got it. But it doesn't mean even Kansas, anywhere, any state has a political story or a list of them that if they haven't been developed, they should be.
Well, let's talk about your first book, which was on Chuck Percy. And, maybe students right now don't know very much about him, but Percy was this major figure in really American politics, defeated the legendary Paul Douglas in 1966, had a long career that only ended in 1984 when he lost to Paul Simon, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Tell me about the impetus to write a book about Percy. What were you trying to accomplish?
I think I don't believe that I was looking to write a book. Because at that time I was I first met him and started following his career. I was working in Decatur as an editor there, and again, this was Bob Howard's work on me. He and I had a conversation at one time about who he thought I ought to be working on as a book. And he said, Chuck Percy is thinking he wants to be president of the United States. Maybe he's a good subject for you. Well, I started working. I didn't know how to write a book. I didn't know what to do. I wrote columns and news stories, but I didn't write books. And so he said, write a couple of chapters and then let somebody who knows the story here in Illinois read them and give you some feedback. Well, it turned out that Paul Simon was living in Springfield, having lost the battle for the governorship, and I had of course knew Paul. And so I asked him if he would look at these two chapters and give me some feedback. Well, he just ripped them apart. I mean, I had to start all over with that, but he kept helping me with that. And I always believed that, and I don't have any evidence of it, but I always believed that Paul was responsible for getting it published when I finally finished it. Rand McNally in those days had a long list of books that they were nonfiction books that they were publishing, not just maps, and he knew the folks there, and I always felt that he was behind. I never asked him, and he never said, but I always felt that he was behind the scene on that. And so once I got connected with them, then I began to develop it in earnest and felt that once I got involved in his story, I was really interested in this guy and where he had come from and what he had done at Bell and Howell and so on and so forth. So I really got in the rhythm of it, and I appreciated Paul's help with it. I thought it was ironic that Paul would then be running against Percy in 1984, and I reminded him of Paul of working with me on that book, and he said that he said, I never liked Paul. I never liked Chuck Percy very much because he beat my hero Douglas And he said, I just never, but he said, I wanted to help you with it. So anyway, that's how that got started.
And I know this was many, many years ago, but do you remember, like, in terms of his edits, was it more, was he urging you to tell stories to kind of avoid political jargon, or do you even remember just sort of the broad nature of what his comments were on those chapters? Again, I know it was many years ago.
Well, yes, I kept those notes for many years. Mainly, it was structural, and following a theme. Get the pace. I guess I'd call it the pace of the writing. And he had some rules. He had, of course, written some books, although most of his books came after that point. But he had some personal rules about writing books, and the passive voice and avoiding that and things like that. And he hit those points as he went through it. He didn't do say, I know you ought to be looking at this and you haven't done that. It wasn't like that. It was really structural work. And that's what I needed. I needed somebody to tell me what a book was supposed to be.
Right. Well, then a couple of years later, you wrote a book about another practicing politician, Governor Jim Thompson. And as I was reading about the story, I was thinking, man, it's tough to be writing a book about a politician who is currently serving, looking over your shoulder, ambitious, looking to their future. I mean, that's sort of a tough subject to crack. How do you recall that effort to write a book on Jim Thompson?
Well, my editor with Rand McNally, Steve Sutton, who was a terrific guy, when I had finished the Percy book, he said, there's another guy there in Illinois who looks like he might want to be president of the United States. Maybe we ought to be doing something with him. And so, under the theory that you write the first book because you can, and you write the second book to prove that the first book wasn't a fluke. And I think that's why I dived into Jim. And it was a difficult book to research. Chuck was open, and I interviewed him at great lengths, and he was easy. And so did Jim. He was. I think I had 5 or 6 interview sessions with him while he was governor over at the mansion. And so he was very helpful with that, but he was very cautious about where I was going with this book. And the story always was that when it was finally published, that he didn't like it much, and that he asked the Illinois Bureau of Investigation to check in and see if I had if I'd done something that I shouldn't have. And so apparently I was investigated by the IBI, and Jim wasn't particularly keen about the book. But I remember also quickly on the Percy book that Lorraine Percy, Mrs. Percy, she didn't like it either, because she thought that I exposed her husband's financial information, and that might make her children more subject to kidnapping.
Wow. Yeah, no, I've done a couple books on people who are alive and still at work, and I've done some historical work. And you can't interview people who've passed, but there's a certain ability to penetrate into subjects and to really pursue it objectively that it seems to me is easier when they have passed and then when they're alive and actually still aspiring for office.
I agree with that completely. I would much rather write about someone who's not here anymore.
Right.
All I have to deal with then are his relatives.
Let's talk about Paul Powell, and what an amazing person. And what I want to do is read a couple sentences and then let you go to town, because you really capture, I think, the full complexity of Powell, because he was a lot of different things. But let me read a few sentences and let you respond. You say, Paul Powell's prominence in Illinois political history is assured, not because of his 35 years in state government, 30 of which were spent in the state legislature, not because he served 3 terms as Speaker of the House, not because of the thousands of laws he authored or caused to be enacted. He takes a place in Illinois infamy because $800,000 in cash was found in a Springfield hotel room after his death on October 10th, 1970. As a result, Powell is remembered far and wide in Illinois and beyond. His legislative career, the contributions he made, and the controversies he spawned are virtual footnotes. In full view, however, Powell was a more powerful state leader than some of the governors who served during his time. So let's talk about that first piece of Paul Powell as just a political powerhouse.
No question about that. And he did it his way. He believed that politics was the means to an end. And that the end may have been important, but it was not the driver. What the driver was the politics, because that's where the power came from. And as we will maybe talk about later, that's where he and Paul Simon had a significant difference about the idea of what government was supposed to be doing. But Powell was a dynamic person from almost the very beginning. I always marveled at his story before he was ever in politics. He was a boy entrepreneur. He started businesses on his own while he was still in high school, and he caught the eye of political people in Johnson County and that part of Southern Illinois, and they saw something in him, and they started him along and encouraged him to run for the state legislature. And once he was there, he seemed to be at home. That seemed to be where he really needed to be. And he did all of those things that you mentioned in there. He did create a legacy that's not many servants in Illinois public servants have been able to do. It was how he did it, and it was the personal part of it. How much money he made, how much he made on the side, how he managed to keep people voting with him with certain help, as it were. He was, I think, without question, corrupt. I don't think there's any doubt about that. He was a corrupted individual. He pulled it off. He was never indicted. He was never formally charged with anything, and so he was smart enough to be able to figure out how to dodge the law, and how to bend it to his purposes. And as a result, people wanted to go along with him because they benefited from that as well. The racetrack story is probably as good as any about Powell and the people he pulled into the racetrack business and that pulled him in, and the extended benefits to those people. So he was always mindful of doing something for somebody else to keep him or her in line with him. As a result, in those days, in those days, the politics of Illinois was much different than it is now. And the two parties swapped back and forth governorships, legislative control back and forth. The legislature was always close in numbers, so it was a deal-making, wonderful land, and that's what Powell. That's what he did. He pulled together deals. It didn't make any difference to him whether they were Democrats or Republicans. If he could get the votes from them and keep them working with him, that was his whole point. So it was a masterful performance. That's probably not doing him justice, but it was a performance and even when he wasn't in the legislature and he was Secretary of State, he was doing the same thing, and maybe came even closer in that role to some legal issues that could have gotten him in trouble than it was when he was in the legislature. but he just was a perfect subject for a book. And I have to say that inject how that book came about. I was living in Washington State at the time and working, and I was doing some research on the racetracks in Illinois, but at the insistence of a person called Paul Simon, who wanted me to be doing some investigating of the criminal history of that area of St. Clair and Madison County. Anyway, I discovered Paul Powell's role in the racetrack, and I wrote an article for the Illinois State Historical Society's history conference, a paper on that aspect of Powell and racetracks. And when I had finished with that, I sent a copy of it to Paul Simon. And I remember very well, he didn't write me back, he called me back and he said, have you thought about making a book out of this about Paul Powell? And I said, no, I haven't. I said, I just wanted you to read this because you might be interested. And I said, besides, I'm working, I don't have time to do a book. He said, well, I think you ought to think about it and I'll talk to you about it later. Well, within days, I had this letter from the editor of the Southern Illinois University Press. And he said, I've been reading this article of yours that Paul Simon sent to me, suggesting that there be a book there. He said, maybe we ought to talk about that. Well, that's how that got started then. And so Paul Simon was at the beginning of that as well. And then when you do a book like that and a controversial person, then you need some help. I mean, I couldn't have done that book by myself. So I had a probably, oh gosh, I want to say a list of helpers that made that book possible. And at one time I did I came to Carbondale for some interviews. I need to mention that another helpmate in this project was David Kenny, he was retired political science professor at SIU, and he and I wrote 2 books together. But David helped set up some interviews in Carbondale. He knew Paul Powell quite well. So I was going to be there, and I thought, well, maybe I'd try to find if Paul Simon was going to be in town, and I'd interview him about Powell. So it turned out that I had dinner at Macanda with Paul and Jean, lovely evening. And then I tape recorded an interview with the 2 of them about Paul Powell. And so help me, it was marvelous stuff. They had so many good stories that I had to figure out how to weave them in and out of that book, because I could see that Simon had some strong feelings, and so did Jean, who was almost a seatmate with Powell in the legislature. So she had some good stories too. But so these people helped me get going, and without them, I couldn't have opened the door. The $800,000 story, I still run into people today. If I mention something about Illinois politics, so that somebody will say, well, what about the guy who had $800,000? I mean, people still talk about that. And it was a difficult piece of the book to pull together. The principles of the whole event were dead. And in fact, 2 of them had died just before I went to Springfield to talk to them. And so I got a lead on a relative of one of the people involved in the handling of the money and the hiding or the finding of the money, supposedly. It was a wife of one of the participants, and I got an agreement she would sit down and talk to me about it. Well, she she had details that were just simply had not been published, had not been mentioned even about that night and about her husband's involvement. And she said, you know, I would appreciate it if you would not use my name. And I said, that's fine. I'll never ever use your name, but I have to use this information, at least in paraphrase, if not otherwise. She said, that's fine. And that's the way I handle it in the book. And I have never since mentioned her name to anybody about that conversation. She's long gone. But those are the kinds of people that open some doors when you are trying to get past the record. The record's important, but and the papers, I just can kind of keep going on this, John. Maybe you'll have to interrupt me. Without the papers of Paul Powell's that were kept by John Rendleman, the executor of his estate, Rendleman saved all of the information that he collected for about Paul Powell for the investigations that went on, plus the actual record of the testimony of the individuals who were involved, including his testimony, Rendleman's, and he gave all of that to the Illinois State Library. And so that material was sitting there, had never been, according to the archivist, had never been used before. And so I had access to that, and that just made the story, along with the helpmates along. Otherwise, I could never have written the book.
Well, Bob, one thing that struck me in your book too, your depiction of Powell is sort of a Lyndon Johnson character, almost a kind of a master of the Illinois General Assembly. And one area that this was particularly pertinent was Southern Illinois University. He was, and I think you had said Dave Kenny was the one who had urged you to really focus hard on Powell's work for SIU, but in your book, you chronicle, this kind of collaboration he had with President Morris, in which over the course of a number of decades, Powell directed lots of money, resources, et cetera, to SIU. Tell us about Paul Powell and SIU.
Well, Paul Powell never attended a college of any kind. And I think he was committed to a growth factor for Southern Illinois. And so the university, or the idea of the university, was important to him. In 1949, when he became Speaker of the House, the university was just a small school there. And Morris had just been hired. And so they formed a bond, a growth bond, I guess is what I would call it. And Powell could make that happen. And he worked with Adlai Stevenson, who was the governor then, and Stevenson, and he had some pull with Stevenson, as you might imagine. They weren't friends, but they got along. They got things done, and they started to work on the SIU part of it, formalizing it, separating it from the University of Illinois, buildings, providing the capital for buildings and so on. This was Paul Powell. This was Paul Powell. There's no question about that. And Paul Simon recognized that. And when he would talk about Powell, he would say, look at all that Powell did for SIU. He said, you can't take that away from Powell. And then he would add, but why did he do it? He did it because it was political. And then Paul Simon didn't like that approach to it. But that's exactly what Powell did. I mean, it was an opportunity for him to use the power that he had. And in those years that he was after the first speakership, till he left the legislature in 85, he was, or 65, he was either the speaker or the minority leader, Paul Powell. So he was at the top of the powerful legislature, no matter what no matter who was in charge. And he used that for the buildings. You can find other places in Southern Illinois that he did that. But I think he was responsible for the growth of SIU, that initial growth that brought it to the top of an institution, of an education institution. And he did it with Morris. He did it with the legislature. He did it with friends. He just did it. And when there was and I mentioned this in the book, when the riots of the protests of 1970 and that period occurred on campus, Paul Powell was very upset by that, and he withdrew he had made a provision in his will for a gift of money to SIU, and he withdrew that in protest, a personal protest. But that didn't stop him from working for the overall good of the university.
Right.
And when I wrote the first draft of the book, I showed it to David Kenny, and he wrote back and said, "You need more on the SIU story." He said, well, you've missed a big piece of this." He was dead right. And so I went back then and I went to Carbondale, and he set me up with some interviews there to get the story of SIU and Paul Powell, which is a leading piece of it.
Right. Well, we've talked a lot about Paul Simon kind of in periphery. So let's bring him to kind of center stage here. And you knew him for decades, as a reporter. As you said, he played a major role in your initial books, both as an editor, and I think you said sometimes he gave you practical advice about finding publishers and so forth. And you also mentioned at one point that you had a substantial correspondence with Paul. Were you in touch over the years? I mean, would you pick each other's minds on politics, or is it more kind of specific projects you're working on? Tell us a bit about your relationship with Paul and Gene Simon.
Well, I was as the editor of the Lindsay Shop newspaper group, and as editor of the Herald and Review and Decatur, I had an opportunity to write columns, and I wrote columns for years in those papers and editorials as well. And so Paul and I he was in the light, and so he made the move to a more personal level. My wife was one time a cello player, and he always referred to her as the cello player whenever he'd write a letter. Well, Paul and I, even after I left Illinois in 1979, I never lost contact with Illinois and with Paul. And this correspondence with him was a peculiar one. Usually, I was sending him some thought that I thought he ought to be thinking about, something he ought to be doing, or asking him a question as to why he had done this, and so on. And then his answer always came back in about 2 lines in a letter. And I have this stack of letters from him that were probably never more than 5 lines at all. And they were sometimes dictated to a secretary, but he always responded to everything I ever asked him about. And when he was encouraging me to write books and so on, he was either on the phone or he was sending me a letter, and it was a sort of a encouragement. I guess that's really what he did mostly with his correspondence, was to encourage me and to keep me online, to keep me working the stories that would form some books, and so it was that was the basis, I think, of the relationship. We had some social times together at the very beginning. When he started to run for governor, I met with him at one point, and I said, Paul, I've enjoyed with some social events with you and Gene, but I think now that you're running for governor, I think it's better for both of us if we put this on a strictly professional level. I said, because I'm going to be writing a lot of editorials about your campaign, and I want to feel free of any personal connection that might influence that. Well, Paul was sort of acted strange when I had that conversation. I don't know whether he was really responding the way he felt or not. He felt hurt. He sort of said, well, yeah, if that's the way you feel about it, I guess I'll go along with it, but I don't think it's necessary, and so on and so forth. So he protested a little bit anyway. But we had those moments when we had to be careful about how we approached our own professional situation. And I, of course, I could write and criticize him in a letter because he was an elected official without impunity. But I even was careful about some of that. I just simply didn't want the personal side of that to be on the record. And yet Gene and my wife Mary and their children did some events together and enjoyed each other's company. So it was a kind of a mixture. I love politicians, John. I don't care what party they are, or how good they are, how bad they are, how corrupt they are. I'm fascinated by politicians, and I like to spend time with them to learn what makes them tick. And that's really what some of the time that I spent with Paul. It was to find out what made him tick. So beyond the public relations, beyond the ombudsman stuff that he did, for example, I wanted to find out why. And he was responsive to that. They never asked me to go off the record. I cannot remember a single conversation with him that he asked me to go off the record and not print what he had said. That's unusual, as you know, in almost any politician. And Chuck Percy was the same way. I was always amazed that Chuck, he never went off the record. And so Paul and I sort of had this extended, I don't want to call it a relationship. It was or a friendship. It was just a cordial feeling between two people, I think. And while I was gone from Illinois, and when he ran for president, we corresponded. He talked about some things he was doing, and in the run for the presidency. And then when he was about to retire from the Senate, he really got aggressive with me on my writing and writing books. And the piece that really I'll never forget was I had sent him an article that I was writing about political happenings just before he went into hospital in 2003. He took it with him to the hospital, and he was editing it there when he died. And Sheila sent me that information after it was over. And that was a really critical moment with my feelings about Paul. To the last, he was being helpful.
Right. Well, so as you have said, when you had not initially thought that you were going to write a book about Paul Simon. In fact, you felt that maybe, for a lot of reasons, maybe there'd be someone else who was more apt to do it. I think you mentioned in one interview, Steve Neal from the Tribune is possibly doing it. But then I think, as I recall the sequence, you wrote an essay for a historical society about Paul and his writings and his journalisms, and that sort of became the foundation of the book. Is that broadly what happened?
Well, that was certainly one of them. I think that I frankly was hesitant to write, to think about writing a book about him. I write about political people. I want to be able to separate my personal feelings from what I'm writing about and the person I'm writing about. And I didn't know if I could do that with Paul. So this article that I did for the that was published about his journalism work and so on sort of helped free me from that feeling that I had. And then I remember a conversation that I had with someone who you may have known named Gene Callahan. Gene Callahan worked for Paul for a number of years, and Gene and I were fast friends for decades. And he was probably the most direct inspiration for the book about Paul. Because I asked him in a conversation, I said, is anybody doing a book on Paul Simon? I said, I just assumed that some academician, somebody, a writer, a journalist or somebody would be working on it. This was 3 years after Paul had died. And Gene said, I don't know a single soul. I haven't had one query. Well, I knew if he hadn't had any query that there wasn't anybody working on it. So that freed me up further, I think, was that I wasn't fighting with somebody else to do this book about Paul. And Callahan, who had helped me immeasurably with the Paul Powell book. In fact, I still have a list of contacts that he gave me to help me with the $800,000 issue, and Callahan was really an important factor in this, and it wasn't all what he had to say about Paul; it was the people he directed me to, and some of whom I've never even heard of. And that, you know enough about writing books that you can't do it all yourself. Somebody has to open some doors for you, even if you don't ask them. And that was the way you worked with Callahan, who was full of information and full of ideas, and he really was the inspiration for the book. And so I owed him a great deal. At that time, and for all of the time. If I had a question about Illinois politics, I could call him and get a call back in 10 minutes, and the answer to whatever I was. And he was another one who never went off the record.
Right. Well, in your book, you have this wonderful quote from Judge Mikva about Paul, and I want you to read it and maybe kind of use that as a broader kind of reflection on his career and his influence. Mikva says, Paul was an absolute free agent, a crusader, chock full of ideas. He took on more causes and more issues than you could shake a stick at, and never ran out of gas. Play off the notion of Paul Simon as a kind of an ideas person, an independent agent, someone who did not really fall neatly within kind of the party typology. He obviously was a loyal Democrat and all. And also maybe some of the limitations that kind of freedom put on his career as he tried to play kind of the inside game, both in Springfield and DC.
Well, I think that one of the contrasts that I can draw with Paul was with Al Dixon, who they were, as you know, closest friends, as well as U.S. senators. And Dixon was an inside guy. He was an inside politician from the time he was in the legislature, and that's the way he operated. Paul operated entirely differently. He operated with ideas. He worked with people of a similar feeling. Mikva was one. There were others who weren't very many, a half dozen or so, and Gene Hurley was one of them initially. That they worked on issues like full disclosure, financial disclosure, those kinds of things. And they had some minor successes, but not really. But he pushed the idea. He was pushing that idea about financial disclosure when he was a U.S. senator. I mean, this was a lifelong issue with him, and there were lots of others like that, and they tended to form up in his books, I think, that he wrote. The 23, I think, were that he wrote. Were his ideas. He was not writing nonfiction works. That he only did the 2 nonfiction books, and all, and they were very well done. But he was writing idea books. He was writing his personal books about ideas and putting them forth. And so this was, he didn't care if he didn't sell it in the Senate or if he didn't sell it in the House. He could sell it in a book. And that was his writing, I think. If you look at his whole career, from 1949, when he took over the Troy Tribune, and all the way through, he was a writer. He wrote constantly, and that's the way he got his ideas out there. And if they didn't float, they didn't float. But if they did float, he helped push them. And if you go back far enough into his early time in Illinois, say the time from 49 to maybe 69, he was writing all the time, writing columns. He in his newspaper, and he was pushing them out free of charge all over the state of Illinois, and that's what he did. That's what he did most effectively, because he knew instinctively he couldn't sell all of those inside. He would not do what was necessary to push an idea inside, because he knew he would have to make too many compromises. And he also knew that he probably had offended some people along the line. And I just think that was part of the Paul Simon that I admired most, was that he didn't let that bother him in terms of getting his ideas out. And that's something that goes back to his journalism days and to his column writing. And when I was doing this book, it's really divided into 2 pieces. It's divided into the Illinois period up to when he ran for Congress, really, and then the rest of it when he was in Congress. And in that earliest period, in the first period, that is the formation period of Paul Simon. That's, in my eyes, that's when the Paul Simon we knew later happened. He developed it on his own, with the opportunities presented to him as a newspaper editor or as a newspaper owner, an owner of newspapers, and as a writer. And so this is where I see Paul Simon developing. I don't think Paul Simon would have been what we knew him if it hadn't been for this early period. And I remember Gene Callahan, after he saw the book, saying to me, I learned something in your book. And I said, what in heaven's name, what would that be? And he said, there's so much of the early Paul Simon I didn't even know about. And so I think that the meaning to me of that was that the emphasis on this time period, which people right now say, well, that's not the way it works in politics and the state and so on, but that's the way it worked then. And that he couldn't do what he wanted to, he couldn't accomplish what he wanted to if he had to do it like Al Dixon did. And he respected Al, and he worked with him and loved him, and they were best of friends. But he did not want to be Al Dixon in any way, shape, or form when it came to pushing his ideas.
Very interesting. Bob, we've had a couple of questions sent in to us, and I'd like to pose them to you. One is from Lorraine from Carbondale, who wants your reflections on a couple other state legislators, Clyde Cho and Ralph Dunn, as also kind of champions of the region. Southern Illinois politicians. Any comments you might make about those two?
I'm more familiar with Clyde.
Okay.
And Clyde and Clyde's was he and Powell were chums, and really Clyde was a Medal of Honor winner, and out of World War II, and Powell was really responsible for getting Cho into politics, and the two of them worked hand in hand on. And really, Cho was really the number 2 person for Powell during the time Powell was still alive, and Clyde was, and that carried over into the attitude about Paul Simon. I think I always felt that Paul Simon and Paul Powell were mortal political enemies, and when Powell was dead, Cho picked up that fight, and was arguing with Simon. He was working behind the scenes in the politics of the congressional district, particularly. But Clyde had a good record too in terms of producing an achievement for Southern Illinois. He was a tough guy. And he came up from he came up differently. He came out of poverty in Southern Illinois. He had a strong feeling about social issues and all, but he adopted the Paul Powell approach to getting things done in the legislature.
Interesting. We have a question from Bill from Chicago, who said, we touched on this a little bit earlier, said, are Illinois politics fundamentally different than other state politics?
Well, I don't think so. I mean, I haven't delved into politics of a lot of states, but I've lived in a lot of states, and you don't live in a state. If you're in do what I do, you don't live in a state without finding out what the politics are like. And they may not have a parallel to Illinois, let's say in corruption or in the governors who ended up in jail or anything. But there is corruption in the history of many states, and there's intrigue, there's political intrigue, and there's fighting, internal fighting, and it pays off in how things get done in certain states. So there are those similarities. When you come down to specifics, to say that certain states have the same things that happened at Illinois, I don't think so. And Illinois does have some unique political backgrounds, but every state had to get to be a state. Every state then had to develop as a state and had to get where they are, and it all happened with some great stories. And I think that's what I would say.
Could you imagine the political careers of Paul Simon and Paul Powell in other states, or is there something kind of unique about Illinois that allowed these two types to flourish?
I would say that there were maybe are Paul Powells in every state. There are the ones who manipulate or work the system to get things done. And sometimes they bend things a little bit. They're not choir boys. They are driven by getting something done, and they will do whatever they have to do to get it done. And to me, that's similar, Paul Powell. I think in some respects, Simon is a bit different. But if you look at some of the political people who have come out of Minnesota, for example, Humphrey, get into the picture of people who had ideas, who wanted to pursue an approach to government. That's not something that Paul Simon did on his own. In fact, he listened to others, he watched others, and so I think Paul Simon was a learner all of his life, a student of politics, a student of human dignity, of approaches to life, and that's what made Paul Simon put him apart from an awful lot of people.
Charles from Hoffman Estates wonders how either Paul Simon or Paul Powell would have navigated our contemporary progressive movement. Would they have been able to situate themselves with the current progressive strain that is in evidence now?
Well, I think of the two, Paul Simon probably would have been the most flexible, and the most, he would look to see what could be achieved and if it fit his idea of what needed to be done, then he would adopt, I think, other people's approaches. But if you look at when he ran for president in 1988, he was running all his own ideas. He was not running on somebody else's ideas or somebody else's idea for running government. And so he was referred to as an old timer. And if you look at what he was saying, he was reaching back and pulling things forward that he felt were important. I don't think he would have abandoned that for a new strain of political activity. I think he would have blended it maybe with what his with his history, memory, and with his approach. But Paul Simon was while he was a flexible person, when it came to his beliefs and how to get things done, he was pretty hard to persuade outside of that. But I think if he thought that he could get some of his things done in a more progressive approach, he would adopt it. Powell, no. I don't think Powell would try to run it the way he wants to run it. And if he couldn't get it done, he just wouldn't get it done. And there are some of those people still around. Certainly in Illinois there are, as well as in other states. So I don't see him being adopting, let's say that, adopting an approach that we think of as progressive, or even something similar to that. He developed his own approach, and if you wanted to play ball, then you adopted that. And he wasn't trying to do something like somebody else in Indiana or Ohio, or influence a broader a bunch of people or ideas. He was devoted to doing what he intended to do, and he would do that now, I think.
Bob, I have 3 more books I want you to write, and I'd like to float them out and tell me just even the kind of the broad topics. I mean, the first one I think is Abner Mikva. I mean, boy, if someone could use a full-scale biography, he's such an interesting person. Second one would be a kind of a comprehensive history of the Thompson years. And third, a really good history of higher education in Illinois. I mean, it's ebbs, it's flows, you know, the relationship between U of I and the other state universities and all of that. How would those 3 books attract your interest?
Well, I'm not trying to flatter you, but I like it. I think Ab Mikva is another one of those almost unique individuals who adapted and worked in an environment, not in Illinois politics, not in an environment that welcomed him at all. It was a very tough run up there in suburban Chicago, and he was fighting the Democrats, the Daily Democrats up there. But Ab then went on in his judgeship and working in I think it was the Clinton administration, and so on. And then I always felt that Ab Mikva was one of the handful of people who produced Obama. He saw he saw something there, and Mikva was pulling the string, working behind to promote and get Obama into the legislative situation and then in the Senate. And I don't think that he's received the applause that he should be getting. He should have gotten for that. Maybe he didn't want it. I don't know. I mean, maybe he didn't want to have the publicity. In the interviews that I did with Mikva on a couple of occasions, he was always very incisive. He had things figured out. I remembered I was doing some work on Adlai Stevenson II and his 4 years as governor. And I talked to Mikva, and Mikva was cranked up on Paul Powell of all people, and how Powell and Ed Stevenson didn't get along, and how that he felt that held back the state of Illinois, that a lot of ideas he felt were important that Ed Stevenson had, that Powell simply wouldn't go along with and wouldn't happen. So he had a feel for what was going on throughout wherever he was, and not just his own place. So Mick was a good subject. I think the education subject speaks for itself. There's some fascinating stories in the education picture in Illinois, and without question. Let's see now, the third one
was Thompson, kind of a comprehensive history of the Thompson.
Somebody's going to have to write a biography of Jim Thompson. I mean, and it is going to be a prodigious business. I can't imagine the documents that will have to be gone through for his career, for just his career as governor. Let alone the time after that and the time before and everything else. He is a historic person in this state, in the state of Illinois. He is history, and it's hard for some people to see that, I think, but he is more than human beings. He was a historic figure, and so you'd have to treat that. You have to think about that before you dive into a real biography of him. But I think it has to be done because if Jim Thompson was anything, he was his own best promoter, and he was a perfect PR guy for himself. And so he did a whole bunch of interviews with the oral history program at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library. And I read all of those, and they were fascinating. But he created his own picture in those interviews. When he got a tough question, he had an answer for everything. And it was always, it didn't pay any attention to necessarily to the history of it or what really happened. He just formed that, and so if you took that as a whole body of work of Jim Thompson, you would have the Jim Thompson story, as by Jim Thompson, and that's what would be difficult for an author to dig through and get and to be able, it was difficult for me to separate on Paul Simon, to separate what he had written. To not be driven so much by what he written about himself and about other things, but I had to do my own independent work to build a story about Paul Simon, and you would have to do that with Jim Thompson.
Right. Well, Bob, final question: what do you do? How do you like to relax when you're not cranking out stellar histories of Illinois and biographies? How do you like to unwind and enjoy yourself?
Well, I'm a reader, and I usually my wife and I, for years now, have every afternoon, late afternoon, we have a reading together, and we've read a range of books, and it opened up some eyes for me about some things that she's been interested in, and so I find that relaxing and also it makes me understand things that I haven't learned before. So that's probably, if I'm not writing something or researching something, that's probably where I spend my time. I might take a nap too.
Well, well, Bob, thank you so much. This has been a delightful conversation. We could go on for a lot more hours, and I'd love to have you visit the Institute when you're back in Illinois and Carbondale. You write about it very kindly in your book on Paul, and just said how important it was to him to build this institute. So we'd love to have you come.
Illinois too.
Right.
mean, that's really what it is. It is his legacy, I think.
Well, we're very mindful of that, and we're trying to do all that we can to advance it. And these conversations really help us do that. So, Bob, thank you so much. And again, I look forward to meeting in person and continuing to read your wonderful books.
I've enjoyed every minute of it.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for watching the first installment of our series, Illinois Authors. Please look at this on our website tomorrow and pass it on to friends and family. Have everyone go out and buy Bob Hartley books. They're wonderful, and you'll learn an awful lot about Illinois. And thank you for continuing to support us and keep the legacy of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.